So tonight it's with great pride that Gramercy Books welcomes acclaimed writer Salvatore Scibona, tonight in conversation with WOSU book critic Kassie Rose. Salvatore's long-awaited new novel, The Volunteer, was released 1 week ago by Penguin Press. It's a deeply moving story that begins with a young boy abandoned in an airport. With its beautiful language and dazzling descriptions, Salvatore's novel tells of a man who loses his identity and so much more during and following the Vietnam War. The Volunteer is an odyssey of loss and salvation and the connections between generations of fathers and sons. You'll hear more about this wonderful book and the writing of it in just a moment. Salvatore grew up in northeastern Ohio. I also want to say that I understand he lives about a block or two away from my daughter. I just found that out about 10 minutes ago. His work has won a Pushcart Prize and an O. Henry Award for short fiction, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Whiting Award. His debut novel, The End, set in an Italian-American neighborhood in Cleveland, was a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction in 2008, and it received the Young Lions Fiction Award as well. A few years later, The New Yorker named Salvatore one of its 20 under 40 fiction writers to watch. But his very first award was in 1998, right here in Columbus, when he received Ohioana Library's Marvin Grant for writers aged 30 or younger who have not yet published a book. Scibona was then 23 years old and one of the youngest writers ever to win that grant, as Ohioana David Weaver, who's here tonight in the front row, shared with me earlier. So we're really,
right there.
And he has
He
it
hasn't
right.
changed at all.
Along with his own writing, Salvatore directs the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. Salvatore will be in conversation with Kassie Rose, book critic for WOSU Public Media, 89.7 FM, a national public radio member station broadcasting throughout Central Ohio. She discusses books with WOSU host Christopher Purdy on All Sides Weekend Books, and also reviews books for broadcast. An avid reader and book collector, Kassie is a member of the National Book Critics Circle and the Aldous Society, which is a local chapter of the National Fellowship of American Bibliophilic Societies. She writes about books on her blog, thelongestchapter.com. For tonight's exclusive event, Gramercy Books is very proud to partner with Bexley Public Library, Kenyon Review, and WOSU Public Media. Copies of The Volunteer and The End are both available here at Gramercy Books, and Salvatore will autograph copies of his books at our signing table after the program. So now let's just get this conversation started and give a warm welcome to Salvatore and Kassie. Thank you.
I'm going to move this over just a little so that I can face you. Okay. I thought we would start with Ohio.
Uh-huh.
Just how long did you live in Ohio? You're from Strongsville, correct?
Yeah, if you count my great-grandparents, they all emigrated from Europe to Ohio, and they all died here. And my grandparents were all born here and died here, and my parents live here, and my siblings all live here, and my nieces and nephews live here. I live in New York, so
Right.
Well,
and how long did you live? Did you leave after?
I went to college, and that was
Okay.
but I still actually own half of a grape farm in Ashtabula County, where my brother lives, my great grandmother's farm. So I don't really. I mean, I don't live here. But I haven't ever really been away for longer than 7 or 8 months at a time in my life. I guess.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So growing up in Ohio, were you a reader, and were you influenced early on in the Ohio public libraries and schools?
Yeah, I had of course I completely took it for granted. I don't now because I work at a public library. But I had a really great, the Cuyahoga County branch library system had a branch down the street from where I lived. And it was, in retrospect, a perfect gift. I mean, there was no one in my family or background was really going to encourage me to read very much, and my teachers did eventually once I got to high school. But before that, there was a public library that was just indispensable. There certainly wasn't a bookstore. Actually, there was a bookstore and it had 23 titles. 17 of them were Bibles.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this Gramercy has a slight
A little
diversity
edge.
edge.
Yeah. So when we were talking before, I mean, you said that you rarely came down to Columbus,
Oh, never.
but you do have this tie to Columbus because of the Ohioana Library.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about that award? Because it was at the very beginning. You were writing, but you were not yet published.
Yeah.
And I think that what you submitted was part of your first novel.
Oh God, I hope no one knows that. Well, it was part of the. It's true. It was part of the. I mean, my first book was. It took me. I usually say 10 years, but if you count the very beginning to the end, it was more like 12.
Mm.
And that, I'd never won anything like a prize of any kind. I was in graduate school, and the administrator of the program knew about this thing, and she said, "Oh, we rarely have someone who is from Ohio under this age. You should apply to this thing." So, yeah, they published several pages from in the whole 10 years since that book has come out, this has never come up. But yeah, there was an early draft of that book that was published in the Ohioana Quarterly.
Yeah.
But it was that book was, I basically wrote it 3 times. I started writing it from your direction, from this direction, this way. And then by the time I got about halfway in, I realized, oh no, I have what I've learned in the writing of these 150 pages has made all of this completely, hokum. And now these 50 pages are all right. So then I kept on going. Then I got this far, but no, all of this needed to go. And then I got to the end, and then I had to start the whole thing all over again, and then revise it rather radically after that. So I'm not really proud of that as a method, and I hope not to have to repeat it. But the second book did take 10 years too, for different reasons. But in many ways, I think you don't. The famous writing is very much like a lot of other things you might want to learn how to do. You can't really do it other than by doing it. You can't learn it other than by doing it. And when I had that good fortune of getting that award, I was 20, I guess I was 23 years old. That's really terrifying. And I had been writing since I was in the 5th grade, but it had been relatively recent that I knew how to use a comma, Yeah.
Well, now you've published your second novel.
Yeah.
And
I guess I'm a lifer.
yeah, it looks like it. It looks like it. So I want to talk about, just get started by talking about the eponymous character, the volunteer,
Yeah.
in this book.
Yeah.
So, and have you describe him? Like, imagine that I'm going to have dinner with him tomorrow night. What would you say to describe him so that I would be prepared sitting down at the dinner table with him?
How old is he when you're having this dinner?
Interesting. That's a good question.
We start with him in 1950, and we go
Through.
we go all the way.
We go
all the way through. Let's just say.
Let's say I'm in New Mexico. First time around.
Yeah. Well, the thing to know about him is that he is a veteran. He grew up in Iowa, and he's a veteran of the war in Vietnam, and he's also survivor of captivity for the North Vietnamese. He was held in Cambodia, although one of the subplots of the book is that because of the elaborate lies, I guess you could say, the public lies that happened during the war in Vietnam, it was entirely classified that he was in Cambodia, that he's in Cambodia even to him and to the other units that he's with. So when he finally, after he survives captivity, he comes out, and after more than 400 days underground, and he meets the people in the intelligence community who were responsible for sending him to where he was, and they inform him that unfortunately he went AWOL because there's no documentation of any kind that could prove that he was in fact taken prisoner. And that sort of sets in motion a whole chain of events where tables are turned by him and then against him several times, but ultimately it results in his going to work for this clandestine intelligence agency that's sort of like a little Borg inside the American intelligence community in the 1970s.
You'd be telling me I was having dinner with a former spy. Somewhat.
Well, yeah, but he would never tell you. I mean, one of the things about the book is that there are layers of he leaves behind. Mm-hmm. He leaves his past behind him multiple times in really radical ways. By the time you get to him in the later half of the book, you know all the way down to the bottom. You know past what he knows. You know his parents. You know his parents' wedding night. But nobody else in the book knows those things. So the reader accumulates more and more and more life knowledge of him. So my hope ultimately is that even if he doesn't want to be known by anybody, which is an ambition of his, that the reader will know him pretty well.
So let's go to the part about Vietnam.
Yeah.
Because much of, at least the first part of the book, there's a good probably 75 pages, maybe 100, devoted to his time in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So you put him not just in the Vietnam War, which is a lot to begin with, but you put him at Khe Sanh, which is one of the most famous battles. Why Khe Sanh? Why not the Tet Offensive or Hamburger Hill? Yeah.
Well, for one thing, it was a target of opportunity because my father was at Khe Sanh, and I knew that very early on as a child. He told me almost nothing about his time in Vietnam until I was like very mature adult. This is what happened to my dad. His father was a Marine in the South Pacific, and had a very, very grave injury. About a third of his face was blown off, and he was put back. He was one of the first successes of plastic surgery. There were so many injuries in the Second World War that there were a lot of there's a lot of opportunity for the science to get better. Anyway, so his face was reconstructed. My father, I think, knew pretty, just sort of assumed that war was going to mean you're within an inch of your life, and he volunteered to go to Vietnam, and within 3 or 4 months, he was in a supply convoy that was unloading it at Khe Sanh when the road leading up to it was destroyed, basically. I mean, I don't think it was just one incident, but it was continually worse and worse, and then it just happened that this one particular day they couldn't get out, so he was stuck there basically for almost the entire length of the siege. The siege of Khe Sanh is really part of the Tet Offensive, and a lot of later historians have said that
it was a distraction.
Exactly, that it was a distraction. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this aspect. Probably many of you are, but the Khe Sanh is if South Vietnam was the United States, Khe Sanh would be where Seattle is. So if you can imagine that the North was running the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia, but if they could get into the South Vietnam, and that was the post, that was the spot where this whole narrative got built up, that if they could take Khe Sanh, then you can imagine almost visually like there's water up there and it will all flood down. But the siege there started in the early in January, and the Tet Offensive started a little bit later, and there's a strong argument to be made now that the North Vietnamese drew all of this attention. They certainly drew Lyndon Johnson's attention. He had a scale model of Khe Sanh built in the Situation Room.
He also wanted hourly updates.
Yeah, and he got his generals to sign public declarations promising that they would not let Khe Sanh fall. There were plans to use nuclear weapons there, partly because it was on the DMZ, and the villages around it had already been evacuated. So it wasn't, unlike a lot of other parts of South Vietnam where there were concentrations of troops, it wasn't very populated. My father knew nothing about this at all. He was under a truck. He was, at some point, he had a parachute that he tied to the ground from the door of his top of the truck down. That was his tent while he was there, and he figured he was very likely to die, but not because he knew that 60,000 North Vietnamese troops were underground surrounding him, and that there were only 5,000 or 6,000 Marines holding the base. And he'd never heard of Thermopylae, but But 7 or 8 years later, he's come home and he's in Cleveland. And he's got a job. He's got a wife. And he's got 3 kids. And he's watching a documentary on TV. And he sees this. He sees they're talking about Khe Sanh. He's like, "Oh, I know who that is. I was there." And then he starts watching this. He didn't have any access to newspapers or magazines or anything like that. And it turns out it was the location of the largest aerial bombardment in the history of warfare up to that time. All he knew was that he was completely surrounded by bombardment continually. So I got that. I have had that imbalance in my mind for a really long time. And also talking to my grandfather, my father and my grandfather weren't big readers, but I was, and I was interested in history. And whenever I ventured any kind of pipsqueaky little thing, about, well, did you know that, they would always, as you can sort of imagine, do some little gesture. The point of which was, you really, really don't know. You really can't know. And what I learned by writing this book and then talking to my father a lot about Khe Sanh was, it wasn't just that I couldn't know what, I couldn't know how they felt. I couldn't know the fear that they had. That's one thing. And that's part of what a novelist is responsible for doing in any case, all the time, no matter who you're writing about. You're always going into the inner life of people where you have no business, and your job is to use empathy and imagination and judgment to get there.
You have been acclaimed already for being very authentic with your Vietnam scenes. In fact, I think the Washington Post. Did you see? I
don't know. I'm not reading any reviews.
Well, I'm not going to tell you, but you know what they did? They compared it to Michael Herr's Dispatches. I mean, that's Dispatches is like the top of the top in the canon of Vietnam literature. And not only that, it's journalism. So it's not like they were comparing you to Cara Marlentes, which is a great book, Matterhorn, or Tim O'Brien, or Larry Heineman. Oh my gosh, it was the most perfect nod to the authenticity to compare it to that. So what did you do to reach that level of authenticity?
Yeah. Well, I think the issue is, in some way, the thing that really was sort of catnip for me in there is not only that I didn't know what it was like, but that knowing what I know now, what we all know now, makes it impossible to really, really know what it would have been like for people on the ground to know. For example, like would they know? So I'm trying to think of an example. They look out from here. You're looking out over a trench, and you see barbed wire, and you see completely barren earth, which for some reason the government is bombarding. And the government is bombarding with B-52s that are coming from Guam. And you literally don't know that the bombs have been dropped until you see the ground explode, by which time they're so high up in the stratosphere that they're gone. Like you could never see them. So the level of like, but I know all of that thoroughly because all of those things have measured and they're in history books, and you can see, we know how many bombs, we knew when they took off. Like I could conceivably get back, and all those things are completely unavailable to them. So somehow, this is a roundabout way of answering your question, but like the way my own knowledge created a special ignorance for me, like was itself another thing that made me want to know absolutely as much as I could. And specifically what I looked for, and what I usually try to look for, is detail that has not been digested by history, and that doesn't stand for anything in the grand scheme, because those are the things that have the power, I think, to only be responsible for what they actually were. So, for example, my father, I asked my father at some point, he said something about having soup, and I said, how did it get warm? And he goes, oh, the tuna cans. And I don't understand what you're talking about. He said, well, you eat the tuna, and then you got these cans. Then we would put sand in the cans. And there was one guy who had a gasser, he called it. Like, of all the trucks, there was only one of them was a gasser, not a diesel, which meant that the fuel, if you took a little bit of it out of the bottom of this guy's fuel tank and put it in your little can of sand and lit it on fire, you could cook over this as a stove. To which I said, why couldn't you cook with diesel? And he said, have you ever cooked with diesel? No, I've never cooked with gasoline either. But like that kind of information to me was, there's some, I don't know if you've ever heard this phrase, but I've never been able to track it down. But another novelist used this phrase, a significant irrelevance, like something that's so vivid and right, and that it's right, and it has the charisma of fact. And part of the reason you believe it in it and you trust it is that you just know it's not there doing anything other than being right. Like Chekhov has these great, like Chekhov will describe like the green eyes of a chicken. No good reason why it's green. You just happen to be green, and you're like, oh my God, I'm right there.
When you're saying that, there is a moment there where he gets an Easter card from his mother, and the $2 bill is ironed.
Yeah.
That moment in the context of it showed what was the mentality in the United States, that innocence that was still had no idea of what her son had been through at Khe Sanh.
She goes to that. Yeah, he goes through this entire harrowing thing at Khe Sanh, and when he gets back to his bunk, there's an Easter card for him from his mother, and it's got a $2 bill in it. And that's crisp because she had ironed it.
She ironed it. It's in the details.
But I mean, then I had, of course, like, I wanted to know, it was interesting to me, like, $2 bills, like, what years were they printed? Only certain years, because, they don't run that press, evidently, so often. It was a 1953 $2 bill. And then I thought, right, so it's an old, that's why he would notice that it was crisp, because it's 1968 when he gets this, and it's still crisp even though it's a 1953 bill. And I go, how is it crisp? I think I might have even written in that, like, oh, it was a crisp bill. And then I looked, damn it, they wouldn't be crisp because it would be too old. And then I realized his mother had ironed it.
Yeah, that's great.
Like, right, that she would have done that she would not. Anyway, yeah.
So after Vietnam, he gets brought into this covert activity that he doesn't want to be part of, and it takes him to Queens in New York.
Yeah.
A big part of this is that he says that he wants to lose his identity. He demands of this man named Lorch that is working with him. He says, no, it's not just a matter, you can't just change my name, but you need to wipe out, completely erase who I was. And this feels like this is much more than a plot element. It is much more than a character development, because even very much later in the book, like 200 pages later, Volley, the volunteer, makes a comment of, he said, I wanted to erase myself because the self is an obstacle. So I'm wondering if you can talk about this concept, because it's pretty important in the book, of this erased self.
I might be wrong about this, but I that's the in the most personal way, that's the reason that I wrote the book, because I have always felt that in the moments when I was most present in the world with another person, in the natural world, fishing, football even, they're moments of perfect tactile consciousness where I had no need of a self at that. And the thing that stopped it was when I remembered that it was me doing it. Self-consciousness was this huge enemy. And it definitely is something that writers have to deal with a lot. And I would sort of talk about this with my East Coast friends, and nobody seemed to have any idea what I was talking about. And it started making me wonder whether this is really a Midwestern value, that there's something, I feel like it's more automatic, I think, for children in the Midwest to be instructed by their parents to keep your head down. That is, do what you say you're going to do, and don't call attention to yourself doing it. The exact opposite is true of anybody who lives in New York, no matter where in New York you live. The point of doing things is in order to have people notice you doing it. I just find that so totally appalling and embarrassing. But okay, so that's sort of a moral point. But in terms of the novel, what I really felt was like, no, I want to take somebody who feels this right from his earliest memories. What would it be like to actually do that? How would it work? Like to not to change your identity, not to what I learned while researching this book is that when that kind of thing happens, it's almost always bankruptcy. People drop their names because they're running away from creditors, or they're running away from kids that they don't want to be responsible for, things like that.
So you did research about someone wanting to get rid of their self, like people who have actually done it, or what would be the reason?
Mostly by way of a backfire, because I didn't want to do what other people had. I didn't want to do anything that was typical of people in that situation. I wanted to do I wanted to present the problem to Wally Freyd and ask him, what are you going to do now?
Okay.
And then let him make a choice, and then confront him with the consequences of that choice, which makes him have to make another choice. And after a little while of that, you've got somebody who's not you. He's not responsible for your ideas, but he is sort of born from that initial problem. And I made a really surprising discovery after like 5 or 6 years of living through the consequences of his decisions this way, that you can do something like that if you want. That is, not show up, be unknown, go on living and be absorbed in the world around you without having to have a name. Go ahead, but other people will pay for it. And the thing that was really, I should have seen it, and I felt like it was, in retrospect, it feels quite obvious to me that like there's a certain kind of independence and selflessness that is so terribly expensive for other people. Children, for example, who count on you through no fault of their own, because you're the grown-up in the house, or people who want to take care of you, people who love you, who chose to love you, and who you basically betray if you refuse to show up in their lives and tell the truth about who you are.
So when you made this decision with him that he was going to just erase the self,
He made the decision.
He made the decision, yes. Did you then know, did you make this happen, and you had no idea what it was going to play out in terms of like the other characters, Elroy and Louisa. So you were discovering then as you were going along.
To a certain, I mean, I have the what you alluded to at the beginning, the scene at the beginning of the airport. That happens in 2014, and I described that on the first page. Okay, this is the beginning. We're going left to right. Then the book goes back 60 years with only the ambition of basically saying, how did this little boy get to this spot? Who would do this to a child? And what would that person's childhood have been like to lead him to be able to do such a thing? So we
probably should say the book came out just last week, so maybe some of you have not had a chance to read it, but the very beginning is a character we meet, Elroy. We don't meet the volunteer right away. We meet Elroy, and in the Hamburg airport, it's a very difficult scene, but he abandons his son in the Hamburg airport. That's what Salvatore is referring to here. And that's in, again, 2010. Is that what you said, or 2014?
I think 2010, yeah.
2010.
I think it's 2010.
And then it drops back to, we get into the 1960s. And
yeah. So there is a little, there is a little, I mean, I say like he's totally free, and it's always a little bit of a fudge with the writer because, you kind of totally free. Like I do put him kind of over there. But, I studied with Marilyn Robinson in graduate school, and she, at one point, very memorably in workshop, someone said, well, I want this. Someone said they wanted something to be free. They wanted the language to be free. And she said, control is what produces the illusion of freedom.
Ooh, interesting.
Especially for a writer, I think. Like, you sit down and you want to let it rip. Go ahead. Let it rip. It doesn't feel to the reader like freedom what they're reading when you just let it rip often. It feels like mess. And it feels like you are subject to your own whims at that moment. But stories that have sometimes, that just seem breakneck, just following one crazy, impossible decision after another, are very carefully plotted out by someone ahead of time, very often. Yeah.
There is a scene, I want to still touch back a little bit on that self. And it's just because there is one of the most moving scenes in this book that happens in the post office.
Oh, yeah.
And it captures, I think, something of what you are talking here about the self, because he sees a homeless man who is lying on the floor in his post office, just reeking of filth and deprivation. And Volley's response to him is that he feels proud. He feels proud for the man. And I'm wondering if you will read...
what page is it on?
It's on page 163. Okay. This is the galley. But 163.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah,
Pride,
there it is.
Pride came out. No.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, that's it. It's pretty. Yeah,
Yeah,
we moved it a little bit.
Yeah.
Pride overcame.
If you start here, Pride overcame.
Yeah, there we go.
and read
Okay.
that.
See, the galleys, the tiniest little changes make the organization of the whole text on the page go crazy. And then at the very end, when I did not want an acknowledgments page facing the last part of the text, and I fought them for 3 months, all I had to do was like add a paragraph to that last chapter, and they bumped it over, and I won. So, for that same reason, incidentally, like it was like about acknowledgments, this is a sort of side thing, but like, you're done with this whole fiction where I'm not there, and then to have like facing you, like the actual person speak. Anyway, yeah, so he's got this, to give a little bit of background about this post office box, when he's in New York, he has a little moment of equivocation about whether he can actually carry through this disappearing act. And ultimately he decides, this is the sort of dawning of the failure of his independence. Like, if nobody knows that he's done it, he doesn't really believe that he's done it himself. And he describes the remnants of a boy that are still inside him that he wants to burn up. And and he can only do that if someone knows. So he rents a post office box, and he sends a letter to this friend of his in New Mexico, and waits for an answer, and he every month he goes to this post office box, and he's waiting for the post office box for something to arrive. No one else has this address, and then eventually he realizes that the point of the post office box is not to be filled; it's to stay empty, and prove that no one exists with that name to receive correspondence there. Mm-hmm. So one day he goes up there and is checking out the mailbox. And this guy, as you say, I'll read the first couple of lines of that section, and then I'll skip ahead. Mm-hmm. The vagrant on the post office lobby floor slept within a cloud of reek that held the patrons all in awe. They stood at steel counters, licking stamps under handkerchiefs and scarves, breathing shallowly. Their sinuses rang. They scribbled a zip code, glancing at one another. Strangers, but they were in tacit agreement, right? This was no mean funk, a smell to shock and shake you out of yourself. The glances said, corroborate, please. We're thunderstruck in the nose, aren't we? We're together in this. The figure on the floor, a pile of clothes, sexless, ageless, every inch of skin and strand of hair covered, the feet covered, all identifying characteristics covered, the face pushed toward the corner of the tile floor as into a pillow. Under the inscribed walls, the heavy soiled clothes and blankets rising slowly and falling slowly with labored inaudible respiration. Inside them, a person. And then skipping ahead. It was pride on behalf of the person within the pile of clothes. Pride overcame him like a sudden wind. He was somehow proud of the figure's endurance, as if he participated in the figure's accomplishment merely because both of them were people. The burden of life a person could carry around, the history a person could hoist on his back without putting it down, the history not only of troubles but of the beautiful things that had happened, the dream of flight, the plunge. In his own case, the blast of sun on his head after the tunnel, the taste of home water, and the trouble too, all of it, the sorrows of childhood, a slug in the back, measureless time, hunger like a knife in the stomach, his recognition at some moment within the dark after Wakefield had died that the lieutenant was dying too, but that he himself would have to continue being alive, the disremembered acts of greed and thirst that kept him living, all this life, too much, far too much of it, accumulated around a person. And it was only his own weakness to want to drop it, to cut it off, to wash it away, to be naked under the sun, to leave others behind and face the sun alone. He felt pride for this person on the floor who could do what he himself could not do, who had chosen not to strip it all away, but to carry the life around on the body and in the clothes, to be a universe, even of bacteria, molds, still a living ecosystem, respiring its reek among the coats and undergarments. A person was a world that walked through the world.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When I read that scene the first time, I think I went through it too quickly. And it was when I was going back through the book again and I read it, the word moving keeps coming to mind, but I could see it so clearly, and it meant it just so brought out what he was trying to lose in himself, and then here was this man who was embodying himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, I walked away from it thinking, yes, we all are a world walking in a world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a real I hate sociology in all its forms, but I do think that's kind of a male issue sometimes, where there's a certain kind of independence in throwing everything away, lighting out for the territories.
Oh, I see.
Thing that is a story that's very hard for men to resist sometimes. I don't know a lot of women who feel that way, but but then there are these moments that intercede. I think were in his case. I find him a very honest person ultimately. Like he's got an ideal in front of him, and he's looking down at this person, asking himself, what is this strange thing that I feel about this person? Why, what do I admire about this person? And it's just that the person wants to keep all his stuff with him.
Yeah. This book spans a lot of places and a lot of time. And unless you're Mozart and you're able to sit down and Mozart was able to just hear a concerto in his head and sit down and write it, or a symphony. And did you know when you were, that the prologue was going to be the prologue, that the Hamburg airport scene, did that start out at the beginning? And did you take this all through, Vietnam and then through Queens and to New Mexico? And it's, even up here, you're saying this thread. For us as a reader, we start with a book and we read through the seamlessness of it. For you, how seamless or unseamless was it for you? Did you find that the Hamburg airport scene was in the beginning, was it really at the end, and then it got switched around? Did it, because you worked on this for 10 years.
Yeah. Well, I was working on it for about 2 years before I had this searing experience in the airport. That's the only thing that's really taken from my life, that I was in it. I should say I was in.
So you were working on the book before.
I was in Latvia working on this book.
Okay.
And I'd been working on it for a couple of years and was really spinning my wheels. And my German publisher asked me to come visit in Hamburg, and I said sure. So I flew from Latvia to Hamburg, and I got these euros out of the ATM, and I spent a reasonable number of them. But it always annoys me to have money that I can't spend when I leave a country. And at this time, Latvia was not on the euro. So I had 7 euros in my pocket. I went up to the podium in the airport to go back to Riga, and I was just going to ask the guy, how much does it cost to buy a martini on this plane? Because I thought it might be 7, it might be 8. If it's 8, it's going to be so annoying, and I'll just go buy a newspaper and some pencils or something. There was this child who was crying in front of me in the line, and the mother and the flight attendant were talking to him. And he clearly had been crying for a while, but in this really controlled, really self-possessed way that was, your heart goes out to any child who's crying, but it was strange. He was like in a marathon of it. Like he was pacing himself. And then the mother got up and went and sat in the chairs, and I realized that she wasn't the mother. She was just some stranger trying to talk to him. After a little while, this flight attendant, older woman, and the boy seemed to disappear for a couple of minutes. And I got to the front of the line, and I asked the guy at the counter how much it cost to buy a martini on this plane. And he said, I don't know. I said, you have no idea? You have a guess? He goes, I don't work for this airline. I said, but this is Air Baltic. He said, they have one flight a day out of this airport. I work for the airport. I said, oh. What was the matter with that kid? And then right as we were saying this, the woman and the kid came around this other side of the concourse, and he had been continuing to cry just for 25, 30 minutes, no stopping. And I said, that one. And he goes, yeah, nobody can figure out what language she's speaking. And that was when I realized, and I looked around at the other people and waiting, and all this information had gotten around to everybody who was watching. That as far as I know to this day, someone had abandoned this kid in the airport. I tried to help him. I tried to talk to him. He wouldn't say what his name was. I tried Spanish and French and Italian. Like I figured, like everybody's probably tried all these already, but whatever. And he was just going, no. He just would not speak, and he was pointing. He was leading this woman like over here and over, clearly trying to retrace his steps. And the really crazy thing was that there was the PA system was making no ambiguity about this in every possible language. There was like, lost child, it is at this gate, it had been going on for a half an hour. There was like no way so I followed them right to the end of the security area, and then the door closed behind them, and I never saw them again. And it was so horrible. I mean, it was just, I was for weeks. I was just traumatized by this, and I realized that I had to do something of some kind with it. So it got affixed in a way to the beginning of the book by way of, ultimately by way of saying, I don't know, I'm here, I don't know, I know the next thing and the next thing, but I don't know this far and this far, but I know I'm getting across the street over there.
Mm-hmm.
I know that between 1950 and 2010, I have to get this guy to intersect in this story all that far, which is, it sort of works like a plumb line. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like he was like a plumb bob at the bottom of the line. There was some kind of straightness there. And I just, I really desperately wanted to write something that was consecutive, unlike my first book. I was just I wanted things to go. I wanted cause to, to effect to follow cause consistently.
Did it work?
Yeah. Oh, it was
Okay.
great. It was really great. I mean, as a fiction writer, I started turning this into like a little dictum for myself that just, if I needed to know, if I was lost, I needed to look at what had just happened and ask myself, what does that make the person do?
Mm-hmm.
That, and that kind of, I have a little theory about like what causes what the phenomenon that what you call being invested in a character, which I think is happens when the reader has a vicarious experience of the character's freedom. So
Say that again.
A vicarious experience of the character's freedom.
Okay.
So in other words, if you I think that in general, if you as a writer are positioning the narrative in such a way that you follow a person through various acts, even if they're consecutive, cause and effect, the reader can follow it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they feel that they're in the character's clothes, invested, right? They don't feel inside the person. What causes that? So my theory is that the wire between you, the reader, and the character is the character's will. So when you bring the character up to a moment, and you make it really clear that the character might choose to do this or might choose to do that, that moment of ambiguity, as you see in all horror movies, right? The woman is like going down the hallway, and you're like, "Stop! Go! Leave the house!" But then why do you do that? Because the circumstance has pulled out of you a desire that she do something. That's being invested in the character. It's when you're doing it from the outside, and you don't know, or you know ahead of time, or you know that it's been orchestrated, that she has no choice. You are safe from the consequences of what she's doing. When she does have a choice, you want to push the choice onto her, and then ideally she does the thing that you don't want her to do, and then people get mad, and then they keep reading, and they keep reading, hoping that for once she will actually stay with the right guy. In the case of my book.
But for you as the writer, there's a lot of trust going on there too, and a lot of pulling of you. I mean, you have to stay very open to what the character is doing and may be wanting to pull you in a certain direction, while you thought, no, I thought you were going to leave the house. Woman walking down the hall.
Or worse, I've already written the chapter about what you're going to do after you leave the house.
Right. And now look what you've done.
Oh, no.
And I'm supposed to go on a trip tomorrow too, and now look what you've done to me.
Yeah. Yeah. My first book, there were 130 pages of Wyoming, a year and a half of work, where I just realized, like, it was like the character, like, looking up at the page and going, I just don't want to go there.
Oh boy.
I'm sorry.
But that was hard.
It's too bad. So.
Year and a half.
Yeah. That's all right.
So this first book, you was nominated for the National Book Award.
That's true.
What a incredible experience for that. That's your debut. Working on your second novel, did it create one of those little voices in the back of the head that, starts, as time went on past being the nominee? Because everybody brings it up. I'm bringing it up now. I like it. You have this little voice here, and you're saying this, quit feeding the voice that maybe making me feel like, am I going to be able to hit that bar again? Or, I feel expectation, or what are people thinking with this second novel coming out, or the third? Would your editor or agent? I'm just wondering in that world
My agent's
where.
been very patient.
Okay.
Yeah, same guy all this time.
Because it's a different world now. I mean, back in the mid 20th century, when writers were working with editors and their and agents, they were nurtured. So if they failed with their second book or their third, whether it was Faulkner or Don Powell or whatever, now there seemed to be, the publishing industry puts great pressure on. I'm wondering if you felt that.
Well, I'm retroactively feeling it now. I guess for some crazy reason I didn't. I don't think, the reason I think the main reason I didn't was that I had this great teacher at the Iowa Writers Workshop, Frank Conroy, who some of you probably know of. And he was a barbarian, and I'm sure he never learned my name.
Didn't he write Stop Time?
He wrote Stop Time, yeah.
Okay.
And I was right out of college when I went there, and I had never taken a writing class. I had taken composition in high school, but we didn't even have writing classes in college. And I was a philosophy and math major. And he, with the very first day at the workshop, everybody was sitting around on the floor in the new quarters in this Victorian house, and he said, "You guys will do whatever you want to do. There are no grades, there are no tests. You don't write any papers. You're just here to learn to be writers. So, we'll meet once a week. We'll see what you've done. If you want my advice, I think that you should write 3 hours a day, the same time of day, in the same physical place, 6 days a week." And I was like, oh, great. Just fill it in and then 23 years later, that's what I do. So I didn't, my habits were entirely plastic at that point. And then someone with enough authority came along to say, try doing this. So then as a consequence of all that, like all I have to do is show up.
At the desk.
And 90% of what I need to do is already done. And if it takes longer, if it takes 10 years, it takes 10 years. I would be afraid if I couldn't get to the desk anymore. Like if it was that kind of thing became crippling. Like if I just sort of go like, no, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And then I will have written 4 books or 10 books or 3 books, depending. But I've got these 3 hours. And now, depending on time, sometimes it's a little bit shorter. I can often go a lot longer now because he had been a pianist. I think he got that training from a piano teacher.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Show up every day and practice.
Just you just have to, whether you feel like it or not, you just do it. And the great wisdom of that, man, especially for a fiction writer, you just have no idea what the unconscious has been cooking up all night. You wake up and you get out of bed and you have nothing going on and you are not inspired and it doesn't matter, and you really would rather like go for a walk or call somebody on the phone, but your body just automatically goes into the room, and then you sit down and then you read what the last paragraph, what I wrote yesterday, and then I go, I changed 2 or 3, and then suddenly my unconscious has, without having told me, that was preparing all of this material for me and gave me no indication, and all of that would have been gone had I not shown up. I mean, it's just, I think everybody who writes has had experiences like that.
Are you at work on a 3rd novel?
I am, yeah. I had, this book was actually a bigger book than it was, and about 5 years ago I had, it was starting to look like the MasterCard logo, where like, there were like 2 circles, and I was so proud. I was like, oh, look at this perfect self-contained world, and this other one, and they don't even have anything to do with each other. The readers all love this. Like there was just this very, very thin place where the 2 worlds mattered to each other, and I cut them apart. And so this part is like about 1/3 of it has already been published in magazines in different places. And it's been cooking for a long time. But it has nothing to. The probably thing is, it really has nothing to do with this book, with this book. And but I also have something like a deadline.
Oh,
for that
yes,
one.
yeah.
we'll see about that.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm wondering if anyone has any questions, would like to open it up to the floor here for Salvatore.
Well, I have a very simple question. What were you doing in Latvia that caused you to go to Hamburg? Was your agent there?
My German editor was in Hamburg, and he sent me an email. I always imagine it as being a phone call because I can hear his voice saying this to me. And he said, since you're in Riga, why don't you come visit us in Hamburg? And I was like, great, I'm sure. And I didn't realize it was like someone in, since you're in New York, why don't you come see us in Chicago? So I'd never met them. They were getting ready to publish my first book. And we had a lovely lunch. I was there for all like 36 hours. And now about, maybe 15-20% of the book takes place there.
Interesting.
Of course, another 30% takes place in Vietnam, where I've never been either. So, yeah.
But was the reason for writing this book to relate some of your father's experiences? Did it develop from that concept, or I imagine I don't want too much figure. I imagine a fiction writer, you want to show many different things.
Yeah.
But what was the driving?
Yeah, I hope I have nothing other than opportunism and greed around his experience that way. Like, obviously there is like my actual human flesh and blood self that feels tenderness toward him and attachment and interest in his experience. But as a writer, he would talk about things with such like penetrating granularity of detail that he would start talking, and after a while I was like, I'm just going to start taking notes when you start telling me about things like this. And I thought it would be because he's in ill health, and people will later ask me like what happened, what did he do, and that, so it's really it really is that simple. Like, I feel like in some way, any very vivid detail is something that you want to appropriate and put somewhere. It's not an homage to him. He doesn't believe that. I think he believes he keeps saying like that. Whatever you named me in that book, and it's not, I didn't name you. It's not him. It's not, anyone who knows you, who reads just 5 pages will know this is not you. He's not Italian. He's not.
Did he read, though, the Vietnam pages, and did he then get back to you and say, that little part where you went here or there, does he give you any feedback on it?
He told me, well, he's not he's not open-handed in praise.
Okay.
But he was very happy, which was shocking but his happiness was, you got it all right. I didn't realize you were listening so carefully. Like, it wasn't a question of art or anything like that. He was just like the ballistics, the distance between one place and another place. And then he would say there are certain places where he'd say like, you got wrong. And I'd say, Dad, we've talked about this before, but you keep saying that the USS New Jersey was in the Gulf of Tonkin at this time, and that they were responsible for these shells that you saw at a certain moment exploding in front of your face. And I know what the trajectory of the 16-inch shells are, and I can show you what the map looks like between the water and Khe Sanh, and they're 10 miles too short. They can't reach that far. And you didn't actually see them, did you? And he said, no, I didn't see them, but that's what everybody said. And I said, I can also tell you that on the dates that you're describing, the New Jersey was on its way to Vietnam, which everybody would have heard about in the newspapers, but it hadn't actually gone through the Panama Canal yet. It was going to be there in June. It was not there in March. So there were like details where which you might say, if you're the father of another father might say, well, that's pretty impressive that you figured all that out. And he's like, well, see, I don't know about it. But
But that's the whole point of that. He was there. He didn't that you were making. That when you are there in the battle, you don't have
Exactly.
the sense of that reality
Yeah,
of what you were
that's it.
sharing with him.
That's it. And also, I think, like, I'm really quite happy with that aspect of things because he, the details are the details are tools, are materials that I use to make something else. There's a whole, I hope, sort of mythy understructure to the story that he didn't read for and doesn't really care about, and it's not his world. All he just wanted to make sure that I had all of the material things right. And I didn't check them back with him, incidentally. I wasn't going to give him anything to read because then I would call him and say, like, hold on, the New Yorker is going to run this painting next to this thing, and I see this thing that looks like a crank. And he texted me back immediately, like, that is not a crank, that is this whole elaborate description of, so we actually fact-checked a New Yorker illustration.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty bold.
They're
Because they're famous for their fact checkers.
They told me. I was actually happened to be visiting, and they said, like, well, we might have cover art, or we might have art for you. And I went over to the bulletin board. Look, there it is. And I was looking at it. And I was like, I don't know about that crank thing. And they said, as a matter of practice, they fact check illustrations.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
If there's something to be fact checked, they're famous for that kind of bizarre. They used to have a standard, like, on average 2 checkable facts per sentence.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that was like the level of
2
inspection.
facts per sentence that they would have to check.
Even in fiction, they would do that. I must have exhausted them with the thing that I ran in there because they only came back to me with like 3 or 4 questions, and I had chapter and verse to give them, like, right there.
Well, only 3 or 4. That's pretty good.
Yeah,
for
no,
only
it
3 or 4 from them.
I think I just wore them out. Like, I think that the poor little bastard who had to do that he wasn't going to be able to dig up all that information.
Does anyone else have a question?
Yes, ma'am.
What is your relationship with the characters you've created? I feel you almost started talking about that, and I haven't read the book, but you're making the people in the book come so alive. I mean, do they talk to you at night? Is the whole thing plot driven? You know them so well. I mean, you've gone into their heads and everything. What ends up being your relationship with these characters you've created? It's like a golem.
It is actually. Yeah, I fashion them, and then they take on minds of their own. Ideally, I think they are independent of me. Ultimately, that's the goal. Is I don't ever want to. I would like to publish another book a little bit more quickly than 10 years from now. But a large part. Something that I've discovered about writing a book over a long period of time and throwing a lot of material away. I think that you can throw away. It's wise to throw away any number of aspects of a novel. To throw away the setting, throw away tremendous amounts of research, throw away pages, throw away chapters. But a character is not replaceable. You can cut the character out, but you can't grow a character fresh today. And by 6 months from now, have the intimacy with that character that you've had with a character that you've been writing on for 5 years. You know what I mean? It's like the character is like you have to think of the character in terms of forestry. You can do lots of things with annual plantings on a farm, as my brother and I are doing on our farm. But basically, we've got these 40-year-old maple trees that are grown up where the vineyard was, and we'd really like to cut them down because they grew up in all these twisted up ways, and they're not healthy trees, but they're 40 years old, and anything that we do in our lifetime is just going to result in something that's going to be a young tree. So I feel like what I'm really committed to is spending a long time with them so that they're free from me, and then when they do things that are interesting to me, I genuinely feel as though I'm watching somebody else freely make a decision that is, they don't know that I'm there. I want them not to know that I'm there.
It's very interesting. Anyone else?
Yes, sir.
Salvatore, teaching has also been a really big part of your life. I mean, last time I saw you were at Provincetown, now you're at the Coleman. And I just wonder, since you work with so many talented writers and you're like reading their stuff and critiquing everything, how do you keep other things and everything, you know, from becoming noise, I guess, in essence, that imposes on what you're writing yourself? Or is that you can compartmentalize them to the extent that they don't affect you?
Not as good as I could be at compartmentalizing, but actually I don't have to teach anymore because there's only one of my job anywhere. It's the Coleman Center is like a think tank inside the New York Public Library. We take 15 fellows a year. They get a year. They get $70,000. They get an office in the library. They have no responsibilities other than to write their books. There are 5 academics, 5 independent scholars, so like biographers, journalists, and so on, and usually 5 creative writers. So these people are all like thoroughly arrived in their careers, and I have a job of being in their company and administering the program and making sure that everything is with my staff, like making sure that they have all the materials that they need. But I don't read student work anymore. And I think it's true what people say, which is that like they often feel that the muscle that's used for writing gets used in critiquing student work. And the problem is that it's very rewarding to read student work. You know, they benefit from it. There's no physical person who seems to be benefiting from your novel as you're writing it year after year. Like there's like no one comes into your office and says thank you. I was really stuck there, and what we talked about helped me. Like there's nothing like that at all. So yeah, it's a competitive. It does compete for your energies. Yeah. Is that it?
Well, Salvatore, thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you
This was
guys
such
for
a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.